It was the kind of crisp autumn morning that made folks in Santa Fe linger a little longer over their coffee. The sunlight slanted golden across adobe rooftops, casting long, sleepy shadows down the quiet streets. Just off the corner of Canyon Road stood Cactus Cafe, a humble breakfast spot with hand-painted signs and the smell of cinnamon and bacon wafting out the door. The locals knew it well. Ranchers, teachers, bus drivers, retirees. They all came here before starting their day, greeted by the familiar clang of the bell above the door and the sound of Patsy Cline humming low from the jukebox in the corner. Inside, the warmth was more than just the coffee. The tables were mismatched, the mugs were chipped, and the waitress behind the counter knew every regular by name. There was a kind of sacred rhythm to the place, slow, steady, honest. That morning, Josie Bell stood wiping down a table near the window, her dark hair tied up beneath a red bandana. She had no idea her life was about to change, or that someone powerful was watching from just a few feet away. Ethan Wallace wasn't the kind of man people recognized on the street, at least not anymore. Once the face of a revolutionary tech empire, he had quietly stepped back from the spotlight after losing his wife to cancer 5 years ago. At 64, he carried the quiet weight of a man who had built a fortune but lost something far more irreplaceable. His silver hair was always neatly combed, his suits tailored but understated. He preferred silence over small talk, delegation over involvement. Even with his 8-year-old son Max, he relied heavily on a personal assistant to handle most of the day-to-day care. Not out of neglect, but out of fear of doing it wrong, of not knowing how to reach the boy his wife once held so easily. Max Wallace had her eyes. That soft brown that looked almost amber when the light hit just right. He was born with mild cerebral palsy, a condition that made movement slow and tiring. Every step required effort. Every shoelace was a mountain. He didn't speak much. Most people thought he couldn't, but that wasn't true. He just hadn't found someone who truly listened. And then there was Josie Bell. At 42, Josie had lived enough life to understand pain and enough loss to spot it in others. She had once been a beloved preschool teacher in a nearby reservation school, until her mother fell ill and the bills started stacking up. Teaching didn't pay enough, so she traded story time and finger paint for coffee pots and table numbers. Now she moved between booths at Cactus Cafe with practiced grace, her warm smile hiding the exhaustion in her bones. She didn't know Ethan. She didn't know Max. But on that autumn morning fate, or something like it, was about to place them at the same table, in the same cafe, and change all three lives forever. The bell above the cafe door gave a soft jingle as Ethan Wallace stepped inside, holding the door open for his son. Max moved slowly, his gait uneven, one hand gripping the edge of his father's coat for balance. It was a routine morning breakfast before therapy, just like every Thursday. Ethan nodded to the hostess and turned to speak with the barista about his usual order. His assistant, trailing behind, had his eyes glued to his phone, thumbs moving in a rhythm far removed from the boy beside him. That's when it happened. One of Max's shoelaces had come undone. His foot caught the dangling string, and he stumbled forward with a quiet gasp, barely catching himself on the nearest chair. No one else noticed. Not his father, not the assistant. But Josie Bell did. She was wiping down a booth near the window when she saw it, just a flicker of movement, a child struggling to stay upright. Without hesitation, she set down her rag and walked over, kneeling beside him. Gently, she reached for the untied lace. Her hands moved slowly, deliberately, as if the boy's foot were made of glass. She didn't speak. She just tied the shoe, one loop then the other, like it was the most important thing in the world. When she was done, she looked up and gave Max a soft wink and a quiet smile. Max stared at her, his lips parted. For a second, it looked like he was about to say something. But then he stopped, eyes lingering on hers like they'd found something familiar. Across the room, Ethan had seen it all. His coffee sat forgotten on the counter. His expression, usually unreadable, shifted, just slightly. Something inside him stirred. The breakfast rush had thinned out by the time Ethan and Max stood to leave. Josie, now back behind the counter, was pouring coffee for a retired couple she saw every Thursday. She didn't expect him to say anything. Most men in suits didn't, not to waitresses with calloused hands and thrift store shoes. But Ethan paused. He turned back toward her, hesitated for a breath, then reached into his coat pocket. Quietly, he placed a sleek silver business card on the counter, his name embossed in deep black lettering. He leaned in slightly and said in a voice barely louder than a whisper, "My son has never let anyone touch his shoelaces. Not since his mother passed. You did something I don't understand." Josie blinked, taken aback by the honesty in his tone. She looked down at the card, then back at the man. But before she could reply, he'd already turned, hand resting gently on Max's shoulder as they stepped back into the morning light. She stared at that card for a long time. The next day, the cafe was quieter than usual. A light drizzle tapped against the windows. Josie was refilling the sugar jars when she saw him again, Ethan Wallace, standing just inside the doorway with no assistant this time. Just him, holding a navy blue umbrella and an expression that was less guarded than the day before. He approached her table without pretense, removing his hat as a gesture of respect. Josie wiped her hands on her apron and raised an eyebrow, waiting. "I came to ask you for something," he said. Josie tilted her head. "If it's coffee, you're 2 hours too early." Ethan smiled faintly. "Not coffee. Help." He sat down, folding his hands in front of him. "My son. He's bright. Gentle. But ever since his mother died, he's closed himself off. We've had therapists, occupational specialists, people with degrees and charts and plans. But none of them ever got him to lift his foot the way you did yesterday." Josie stayed quiet. "I don't care about certifications," he said, his voice tightening. "I care about results. What I saw yesterday wasn't technique. It was patience. It was kindness. I was wondering if you'd be willing to come to our home, a few times a week. Help Max with basic care skills. No expectations. Just that same patience you showed him." Josie exhaled slowly. It had been years since anyone asked her to teach anything. Even longer since someone looked at her as more than a waitress. "I'm not licensed anymore," she said. "I know," Ethan replied. "But you're the first person he's trusted since his mother." There was a long pause. Outside, the drizzle turned into a steady rain. Josie looked past Ethan, toward the street, where the wind tugged gently at the cafe sign. She thought about her mother, the stack of bills on the kitchen counter, the feeling of a child's tiny foot resting still in her hand. Then she looked back at the billionaire who was offering her nothing more than a chance. "I'll come," she said softly. "But not for your money." Ethan nodded once, solemn. "I didn't think you would." Josie sat in the break room long after Ethan had left. The silver business card he'd given her yesterday still rested in the pocket of her apron, but now its weight felt different, like a quiet knock on a door she thought had been closed for good. She sipped cold coffee and stared at the rain tracing lines down the window. Her thoughts drifted back to the classroom she once called home. Finger-painted walls, the smell of crayons, the sound of tiny voices calling her Miss Bell, as they ran to hug her legs each morning. She remembered the pride in helping them learn to tie their shoes, button their coats, write their names. Simple victories that meant the world to little hands. But this was different. Max wasn't just a quiet boy. He was a child shaped by grief, by challenge. Teaching him wouldn't be like teaching the others. What if she failed? What if her patience ran thin, or her old methods didn't work? She hadn't taught in years. And this wasn't a classroom. It was a billionaire's home, and Max wasn't just any student. Josie had seen the way Ethan looked at his son, as if he loved him deeply, but didn't know how to reach him. And she had seen something else too, something in Max's eyes when she tied his shoelaces. A flicker of trust. Of hope. She recognized that look. She had seen it once in a boy named Daniel years ago, a foster child who flinched when someone raised their voice. On his first day of school, he sat with his arms wrapped tightly around his knees, refusing to speak to anyone. But Josie hadn't rushed him. She brought him a plush bear and sat beside him every day during recess until, one afternoon, he reached over and took her hand. It had started with that small moment, like it had with Max. Josie leaned back in her chair, fingers laced across her lap. The cafe hum faded around her. She didn't know if she had what it took. But she knew what Max needed wasn't perfection. It wasn't a textbook or a diagnosis. He needed someone who wouldn't give up. By the time her shift ended, her decision was made. She walked through the rain to her car, Ethan's card pressed between her fingers. The money didn't matter. The title didn't matter. What mattered was that something inside her heart, the part that used to light up when a child learned something new, had stirred again. The next morning, she dialed the number on the card. Ethan picked up on the second ring. "I'll do it," she said, voice calm but steady. "Not for the paycheck. For Max." There was a pause on the line. Then Ethan simply said, "Thank you." She could hear the relief in his voice. After she hung up, Josie stood quietly by the window, watching the storm break. For the first time in a long while, she felt like a teacher again, not by title, but by purpose. And that made all the difference. The first session didn't go as planned. Josie arrived at the Wallace estate early, dressed simply but neatly, her old canvas tote bag slung over one shoulder. Max was waiting in the sunroom, sitting cross-legged on a rug beside a tray of wooden blocks. He didn't look up when she entered. Ethan introduced them again, then quietly stepped away, giving them space. Josie knelt a few feet away, careful not to crowd him. "Hey there," she said softly. "Mind if I sit?" Max didn't answer, but he didn't move away either. She took that as permission. Minutes passed in silence as Josie unpacked a few items from her tote: colorful yarn, a small rubber fox toy, and a brand new shoebox wrapped in brown paper. Max glanced at it once, then quickly looked away. After a while, Josie tried. "I brought something for us to practice," she said gently. "Would it be okay if I helped you with your shoes?" Max instantly pulled his feet back, clutching them beneath his legs. His jaw tightened, eyes fixed on the floor. Josie didn't reach for him again. Instead, she smiled and sat back. "Okay. Not today. That's all right." She opened the wrapped box herself and lifted out a pair of children's sneakers, bright orange, with tiny cartoon foxes printed near the heels. Max looked at them for a split second, curiosity flickering across his face. Josie caught it. "These belong to a very clever little fox I used to know," she said playfully. "Want to hear his story?" Max didn't nod, but he didn't shake his head either. So Josie began. "Once upon a time, in a forest just beyond the canyon, there lived a fox named Felix. Felix was small, like most foxes, but what made him special wasn't his size. It was that he always wanted to do things on his own. One day, he was invited to the Grand Forest Fair. But to get in, all the animals had to tie their shoes." She paused, watching Max's expression. "Well," she continued, "Felix had never tied his shoes before. Everyone laughed at him. 'Foxes don't wear shoes,' they said. But Felix didn't care. He went home, found 2 pieces of rope, and practiced every day. He tied them around pine cones, tree roots, even his tail. And on the day of the fair, guess what?" Max's eyes lifted, just barely. Josie leaned in. "He tied his own shoes. Perfectly." And everyone cheered, not because he did it quickly, but because he never gave up. For the first time, Max met her eyes. There was no smile, but there wasn't resistance either. Josie gently placed the fox shoes on the rug between them. "These look a lot like Felix's," she said. "They don't bite, I promise. You can just look at them today." Then she pulled out the little rubber fox and began looping yarn through its paws like shoelaces, humming softly as she worked. Max didn't say a word. But he reached forward, slowly, and touched the edge of the fox toy with one small finger. It was a start. They settled into a quiet rhythm over the days that followed. No pressure, no expectations. Just a boy, a woman, and a growing pile of colorful shoelaces. Josie never asked Max to tie his shoes again. Instead, she brought him something new each day, a single lace in a different color. Some were bright reds and blues, others soft pastels. One morning she brought one that shimmered faintly gold under the sunlight. This one, she said, holding it up with a small smile, belonged to Felix the fox on the day he met the Owl King. Max didn't reply, but he reached for it. They didn't use real shoes. Not yet. Josie had sewn together a plush fox toy with big floppy feet just for practice. She let Max hold it, play with it, even give it a name, Flip. Every day, Max would sit cross-legged on the rug, threading that day's lace through Flip's paws with slowly improving fingers. He was quiet, focused. Sometimes his tongue poked out just slightly as he concentrated. Josie praised the effort, never the outcome. Almost, she'd whisper. That loop is tricky, huh? Felix had trouble with that one too. Max didn't speak, but he started humming sometimes. Just soft notes under his breath. Josie didn't interrupt. She let the silence stretch as long as it needed. Each color told a story. The green lace helped Flip escape a muddy hill. The purple one got him into the forest dance. The silver one? That was for when he tied both shoes in the dark. 2 weeks passed like that. On a warm Thursday morning, just as the sun stretched long fingers across the hardwood floor of the Wallace sunroom, Max did something he'd never done before. Josie had just finished tying a new lace onto Flip's foot when Max shifted his position. Without a word, he stretched out his right leg and placed his foot gently in her lap. It wasn't a demand. It was a question. Josie looked up, surprised. "You sure?" Max nodded, barely, but enough. She didn't smile too wide, afraid it might break the moment. Instead, she reached down, held the soft fabric of his sneaker, and guided his fingers to the lace. "This part," she said softly, "is where Felix used to get stuck. Want to help me show him how it's done?" Max's small hands moved slowly. Awkward. Hesitant. But this time, he didn't pull away. They looped. Crossed. Pulled. And when they were done, when the bow sat crooked but proud on top of his shoe, Josie didn't clap or cheer. She just looked him in the eye and said, "I think Felix would be proud." Max blinked. His lips twitched. And for the first time, Josie saw the faintest, most fragile smile cross his face. Across the hall, Ethan stood in the doorway. He hadn't said a word during the entire session. But now he turned quietly and walked away, brushing his sleeve against his cheek. Because sometimes, the smallest gestures speak the loudest. Ethan hadn't meant to watch. He had only come to check in, to see how things were going, to remind Josie she could leave early if Max grew tired. But the moment he paused in the doorway, the scene before him rooted him to the floor. There was Max, his guarded, quiet boy, sitting cross-legged on the rug with one shoe already tied and the other in Josie's lap. Josie wasn't rushing him. She wasn't coaxing or correcting. She simply held the shoelace steady as Max's fingers fumbled with the loops. They worked in silence, like a team. And when the final knot came together, lopsided but unmistakably his, Max looked up at her, his face brighter than Ethan had seen in years. Then Max smiled. It was small, fleeting. But it was real. And Ethan couldn't breathe. He stepped back quietly, one hand covering his mouth. For years, he had poured resources into therapists, educators, private programs, all of them respected, certified, decorated. But none had brought that look to Max's face. None had ever been able to reach into his world the way Josie just had. He walked down the hall slowly, his heart both heavy and light, unsure which emotion would land first. Later that evening, in the drawing room, the murmurs began. His sister-in-law, always sharply dressed, always skeptical, folded her arms. "She's a waitress, Ethan. A woman with no formal credentials, no experience with special needs children. This is your son we're talking about." A family advisor chimed in, less confrontational but equally concerned. "You're a public figure. What message does it send if you hire someone off the street?" Ethan didn't raise his voice. He simply poured a glass of water, sat down at the head of the table, and looked each person in the eye. "My son tied his shoe today," he said quietly. The room went still. "He tied his shoe," Ethan repeated, voice cracking just slightly. "Do you know what that means for him? For me?" No one answered. She didn't teach him with charts. She didn't diagnose or prescribe. She sat on the floor and believed in him. And for the first time since his mother died, he let someone in. He looked out the window for a moment, then turned back to them. "I trust her," he said firmly. "Because my son did first. And that's the only credential that matters to me." No one dared argue after that. It was a Sunday morning, clear and brisk, with a kind of sky that made Santa Fe look painted. Josie had agreed to meet Max and Ethan at the Cactus Cafe for a quick breakfast before their weekend session. Nothing formal, just pancakes and laughter and the scent of maple syrup clinging to the air. Max had grown more comfortable in public. He still didn't say much, but he held Josie's hand now, and when he smiled, it didn't feel like a secret. Ethan sat at the booth across from them, watching quietly, his coffee untouched as he listened to the soft exchange between his son and the woman who, somehow, had managed to unearth the joy he thought was buried forever. Outside, someone watched them too. A man in a tailored jacket and mirrored sunglasses lingered near a pickup parked across the street. He held his phone low, angled just right. A quick snap. Then another. Max, leaning into Josie's side. Josie brushing the hair from the boy's face. Ethan looking on. The post hit social media that afternoon. Billionaire Ethan Wallace lets waitress play mommy to his disabled son. A blurry photo. A cruel caption. And a comment section ready to feast. By nightfall, tabloids had picked it up. Bloggers ran with the angle. "Is the mysterious woman grooming the Wallace heir?" one headline asked. "A former teacher turned cafe worker. Does she have an agenda?" They didn't know about the Fox stories. The shoelaces. The broken-hearted boy who had finally tied a knot with his own hands. They didn't care. The phone at the Wallace residence rang non-stop. Messages poured in, some from old business partners, others from cautious friends, all with the same question. Who is she really? Ethan stared at the article on his tablet, jaw tight. The photo was invasive, but what angered him more was the suggestion, the baseless doubt painted as fact. Josie had never once asked for money. Never leveraged his name. She came when she said she would, stayed longer than expected, and left quietly. Her focus had never been him. It had always been Max. But now, her name was being dragged through dirt she hadn't earned. And Ethan knew, this wasn't just noise. It was a storm. One that might push her away for good. Ethan's anger had been simmering ever since the unrelenting storm of social media outrage had reached his doorstep. By mid-afternoon, when his phone began ringing non-stop with critical voices and doubtful inquiries, he reached his breaking point. In a hushed tone that carried both disappointment and fury, he ordered his assistant to inform Josie that she was no longer welcome at the Wallace mansion. The words were firm and final. Josie must cease all visits immediately. The decision, Ethan believed, was necessary to protect his son's reputation and, in his mind, to safeguard the fragile world he had built. Inside the mansion, Ethan paced slowly along the polished floors of his study, his mind a chaotic swirl of regret and indignation. How could the media twist simple acts of kindness into an opportunity for scandal? Every image of Josie helping Max, Every tender moment between teacher and student had been transformed into fodder for malicious headlines. For Ethan, the very idea that someone might misinterpret the gentle bond that was forming between his son and the woman who had shown him a spark of hope was unbearable. The shame and the potential repercussions were too heavy to ignore. In his anger, he believed that severing ties would somehow restore control over the narrative. But Josie was not one to be easily silenced or intimidated by power or wealth. Although the message reached her that very evening, a curt instruction to stay away from the mansion, she chose a different path. Rather than sulk in silence or pack her belongings out of resignation, she decided to leave a final message that spoke more to the heart than any public statement could. Without delay or second thought, she sent a small package to the Wallace estate. Inside, wrapped carefully in plain brown paper, was a pair of red fabric shoes, precisely the kind of whimsical childlike shoes that could only belong to a storybook. Attached to the package was a handwritten note, its message simple and haunting: "The boy has learned to tie his shoelace. But I hope he doesn't have to untie them because he's been abandoned." When Ethan received the package the next morning, he hesitated before opening it. The red fabric shoes seemed to radiate a quiet defiance, as though they carried the echo of every lesson, every moment of gentle guidance Josie had shared with Max. Slowly, his fingers peeled away the wrapping, and his eyes landed on the note. Each word struck him like a reminder of the truth he had been trying to bury. Max had trusted her, and in that trust, a small yet significant transformation had taken place, a transformation that could not be undone by mere orders or the force of wealth. In that silent moment, as he held the note in one hand and the tiny shoes in the other, Ethan's rage began to ebb, replaced by a deep, conflicted sorrow. It was as if the red shoes had spoken the truth he was too afraid to acknowledge, that no amount of status or control could replace the quiet, persistent power of kindness and genuine human connection. Even as he grappled with his own misgivings, the message resonated with him. Was it possible that, in trying to shield his son from public scrutiny, he was also shutting the door on the one person who had truly reached him? The decision he made in anger had, perhaps, cost him more than he ever anticipated. Ethan realized that his efforts to control the situation had only magnified the very vulnerability he sought to erase. In that moment of introspection, the red shoes became a symbol of hope, of change, and of the undeniable truth that sometimes the most profound lessons are taught not by authority or credentials, but by the gentle persistence of a caring heart. The truth, as it often does, began to unravel in silence. Ethan had remained restless for days after Josie's departure. The red shoes sat on his desk like a quiet accusation, one he couldn't bring himself to move or discard. His son had withdrawn again, retreating into a silence Ethan thought they had left behind. And deep inside, a gnawing voice whispered that he had made a terrible mistake. But it wasn't until his head of security handed him a thin file one morning that the full picture began to form. "Sir," the man said, setting the folder down gently, "we traced the original photo. The one posted on social media." Ethan opened it slowly. Inside was a name he hadn't seen in years. Colin Ridge. A disgraced tech blogger. Once a rising star in the industry's media scene, until Ethan personally had him blacklisted for fabricating a story about a data breach in Wallace Technologies. The man had lost everything after that: contracts, credibility, the respect of peers. And now, apparently, he wanted revenge. "He's been working under aliases," the security officer continued. "Runs a network of low-traffic gossip blogs now. Still has a few connections in freelance media. He was in Santa Fe last weekend. Booked a room across from the cafe." Ethan's jaw clenched. So it wasn't coincidence. It wasn't curiosity. It was calculated. Colin had seen them, Josie and Max, and knew exactly what kind of damage a carefully framed photo and a misleading caption could do to a man like Ethan Wallace. It wasn't about truth. It was about twisting perception, planting just enough doubt to make people wonder. Josie had nothing to do with it. She hadn't courted the spotlight. Hadn't sought gain. In fact, she had only ever stepped into Ethan's world to help a boy who barely spoke, and now barely smiled. Ethan leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the photograph again. This time, he didn't see scandal. He saw a moment of peace, a boy safe in the presence of someone he trusted. And he had ruined it. For the sake of optics. For fear of gossip. For pride. The silence in the room grew heavier. He thought of her words again. I hope he doesn't have to untie them because he's been abandoned. Not by the world. By him. With a heavy breath, Ethan rose from his chair. He didn't need more investigation. He didn't need legal action. He needed to make something right. The house had grown too quiet. Ethan noticed it more with each passing day since Josie's absence. Max no longer waited by the front window in the mornings. He no longer sat on the rug with his plush fox or practiced looping shoelaces with bright-colored yarn. Instead, he moved slower, his energy dimmer, his silences heavier. One afternoon, just as the light began to fade through the tall windows of the Wallace home, Ethan climbed the stairs toward Max's room. Something had pulled him there. Intuition, maybe, or guilt. Perhaps both. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, Max sat on the edge of his bed, bent over one shoe. He gripped one end of the lace tightly, while his other hand struggled to pinch the loop. He was trying, earnestly, clumsily, but the knot had tightened in a way he couldn't undo. The effort was turning his small face red, his breathing quick and shallow. Ethan stepped into the room without a word and knelt beside him. "Hey buddy," he said softly. "Need some help?" Max didn't look up. He just nodded once, barely. Ethan reached for the tangled lace and slowly began working it loose, careful not to tug too hard. It wasn't the first time he had helped Max with his shoes, but it felt different now. The silence between them wasn't just quiet, it was loaded with something unspoken. As Ethan finished untying the knot, Max finally spoke. "Dad," he said, voice low, words fragile. "Why doesn't Miss Josie come anymore?" Ethan froze. It wasn't the question itself that stunned him. It was the way Max asked it, not with confusion or frustration, but with sadness. With longing. Like something in him had noticed the absence in a way deeper than routine. Ethan swallowed hard. He looked at his son, truly looked, and saw it. The flicker of hope that had once lived behind those amber eyes had dulled again. Josie had touched something no one else had, and now that she was gone, it was as if a door had closed from the inside. "She had to go away for a little while," Ethan answered gently. "But it wasn't because of you." Max turned his face toward the window. He didn't cry. But his voice, when it came again, was almost a whisper. "Did I do something wrong?" Ethan's heart cracked open. "No," he said immediately, moving to sit beside Max on the bed. "No, son. You didn't do anything wrong. I did." Max didn't respond, but he leaned slightly toward his father, just enough for Ethan to notice. In all his years building companies, managing crises, leading thousands, Ethan had never felt more helpless than in that moment. Because there were some mistakes money couldn't fix. And there were some people, like Josie, whose value couldn't be measured in resumes or reputations. He looked down at Max's small shoe, now untied again, and knew one thing for certain. He had to make it right. The morning light washed over the adobe walls of Cactus Cafe as if the sky itself had decided to forgive. Inside, the tables were half full, the scent of fresh coffee and cinnamon biscuits curling in the air. Josie stood behind the counter, tying on her apron, her movements slower than usual. It had been weeks since she'd last seen Max, weeks since the quiet ache in her chest had started to feel like something permanent. She didn't expect to see Ethan again. So when the door chimed and she looked up to see him standing there, holding a familiar brown box in both hands, her breath caught. He walked toward her without a word, dressed simply, no assistant in sight. His expression was different this time. Not guarded, not proud. Just honest. He placed the box on the counter and opened the lid to reveal the tiny red shoes she had left behind. "I was wrong," Ethan said quietly. "But my son wasn't. He chose you, The first person he's trusted since his mother passed. Josie looked at the shoes, then at him. The silence between them said more than apologies ever could. She nodded once. And just like that, she came back. Weeks later, the sunroom in the Wallace estate was filled with guests. Parents, educators, neighbors, and children of all ages, some in wheelchairs, others holding plush toys or fiddling with yarn. A hand-painted sign read, "The Shoelace Project." Josie stood beside Max at the front of the room. The project was her idea, but the heart behind it was his. Through stories, games, and everyday objects, they would teach children with special needs how to navigate basic life skills, with patience, humor, and love. As cameras flashed and polite applause broke out, Max stepped forward. He looked down at his shoes. Bright red fabric ones, still a little too big. With deliberate care, he bent down and tied them, slowly, shakily, but all on his own. Then he looked up at Josie with a wide, proud grin. "I did it myself, Miss Josie," he said. "All by myself." Her eyes brimmed with tears. Ethan's did too. And for the first time in a long time, the world felt exactly as it should. Ethan stood near the back of the sunroom, away from the cameras, away from the gentle clatter of folding chairs and polite applause. But his eyes were fixed on only one thing: his son standing proudly in the center of the room with his chin lifted, his laces tied, not perfectly, but completely on his own. It was such a small act. Tying a shoelace. But to Ethan, it felt like watching his son climb a mountain. One loop. One pull. One quiet moment of victory. Max had done it without fear. Without hesitation. And when he looked toward Josie with that bright, unguarded smile, Ethan felt something break wide open inside him. The pride in his son's voice. The look of sheer joy on Josie's face. And all at once, Ethan felt the tears come. He didn't fight them. He let them fall, softly, silently, as he thought about the path that had led them here. The therapist reports. The endless consultations. The loneliness Max had carried. The weight of his own guilt, his own detachment, all wrapped in tailored suits and good intentions. He had tried to stand tall for his son. But it wasn't until now that he understood the truth. Sometimes, a father has to kneel. Not in weakness, but in love. In humility. In order to see the world from his child's point of view. As the ceremony came to a close, Ethan stepped forward, picking up one of the red training shoes Josie had used in her lessons. He held it gently, reverently, as if it were a sacred object. Then, turning to the audience, he spoke just one quiet sentence. "A well-tied shoelace can help a child stand tall," he said. "But sometimes, it teaches a father how to kneel." If you believe that patience can create miracles, give this video a like. And if you'd love to hear more everyday stories of kindness and hope, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. See you next time.